From the Swiss Alps to the Canadian Rockies, celebrating unique connections between Switzerland and Canada. Brought to you by the Swiss representations in Canada.
Welcome to this edition of the webcast From the Alps to the Rockies. My name is Urs Obrist. I am the Senior Science and Technology Counselor at the Embassy of Switzerland in Canada. It is my great pleasure to welcome today the Ambassador of Switzerland to Canada, Ms. Salome Meyer. In light of her imminent departure from her post, the podcast team found it an opportune moment to let her review her experience coming from the Alps to the Rockies to work in Canada as a Swiss diplomat for almost 4 years. So welcome, Ambassador Meyer.
Well, thank you, Urs. Thanks for having me.
In your case, I actually would have to specify that it is the pre-Alps that were the picturesque backdrop of your childhood years in the town of Hüneberg in the canton of Zug. Looking back at this time, in what ways would you say were the landscape near the beautiful Lake Zug and the view to the pre-Alps impacting your childhood and possibly shaping your outlook on life?
Oh, well, that's a wonderful question to start with. Well, I have to say, Hüneberg is really a beautiful corner of the world. And I do remember when I was biking to school, I had this mountain panorama in front of me. And quite regularly, I was sort of imagining, being an explorer who would go to these Alps and go, discover them. So yeah, this drive to go and explore maybe was indeed motivated by the mountains. But I think the town itself was an interesting one because Hüneberg is a small rural town. It's got a strong farming community there on the one hand, but also quite a lot of expats who live in this town, and they live there and they go and work in Zurich and other places. And so that gave me an opportunity to both be rooted in tradition, but also got the exposure of different cultures, different backgrounds, different languages. And I found that really quite inspiring. And at the end of the day, though, I don't think it's the town or the pre-Alps, but my parents who always just encouraged me to go explore and learn, whether it's intellectually, but also by engaging with other people. So I had a wonderful childhood, great parents, and lots of motivation to go explore the world.
Mm-hmm. And your first kind of venture into the world within Switzerland was to move towards an equally picturesque area. The capital of Switzerland, Bern, is where you undertook your studies. And for those who are familiar with the university campus, they will know that from there you can have a marvelous view onto the Eigenmönch and Jungfrau Massif. You pursued studies there, a master's degree in modern history, communications, and constitutional law. And your focus, as I understand, was on imperialism and genocide research. And you also undertook an exchange semester, speaking of exploration, at the Rhodes University in South Africa, in Grahamstown. What led your choice of this subject? Was this primarily driven by interests, or you already kind of anticipate the future career in the diplomatic world?
No, to me, it was a non-brainer. I was genuinely interested in all of these subjects. They ticked all the boxes. And I have been, and I still am, really interested in structural, let's call them structural dynamics of history. So imperialism, genocide studies very much fall into that category. But I didn't study with diplomacy as a goal or specifically in mind. Actually, what I had planned for myself was to either pursue an academic career or to go into journalism. So diplomacy really came later.
And then, interestingly enough, as graduation came around, you did something that actually not too many history students would do. You started your own tech company. How did this come about?
Yeah, well, I mentioned before that finding out, exploring new worlds, literally, is something that really intrigues me, and I'm interested by. And the internet, when it came to be, so early 90s and mid 90s, I was just deeply fascinated by it. I wanted to do something with it. There were lots of opportunities around it. And so my brother, who's an engineer, and he was working at banks and insurance companies at the time, my brother and I founded this company, and the goal was really to develop a intuitive intranet solution, which would be based on urban planning, urban development. And yeah, we got quite somewhere. We did get funding, we did do the programming, but the dot-com bubble was our undoing. But I would like to add, though, that even though that was not a success, I had learned a lot. And at the end of the day, for me, that really informed me that failure is something that you can deal with, that you can take takeaways with, and that's something that maybe in Switzerland is not culturally not so strongly entrenched. So failure is seen as really a failure, whereas here in North America, in Canada, people try, they might fail, they learn from it, they go on. And so this tech company experience of mine at the time really did give me something for, not just for diplomacy, but for my entire sort of outlook on how to go about careers and life in general.
Mm-hmm. That's an interesting point. I think in diplomatic world as well, failure is not necessarily considered as something very positive. You want to get it right on the dot the first time around, no?
Yeah, well, diplomacy is, the art of the possible. And that, in my opinion, does imply failures. But again, failure might just be a step towards success.
Mm-hmm. And so we're already in the midst of your diplomatic work. Basically, as I understand it, after you had done your exploration into the tech world, you entered your diplomatic career. When I look at your CV, you had stints in Korea, England, China, and now here in Canada since February of 2019, both as ambassador responsible for Canada, but also the Bahamas. When I look at these countries, I kind of fail to see some sort of geographical preference. Were these postings set up for you by luck, or was it specific considerations for you that you thought, oh, I really need to be in these certain countries for specific interests that you might have had?
Oh, I guess it's a little bit of both. I don't have a long-term career strategy, whether it's on geographical expertise or on topical expertise. And the reason why I don't have this strategy is I want to prevent constantly, having a mindset of running after the future. I think as a diplomat, it's very important to be in the present. So from that perspective, it was without a plan. But then on the other hand, these are all postings that were really interesting, both from the sort of dynamics within the host country, but as well as from the bilateral sort of perspective, and getting an Asia perspective on Switzerland, a North American or Canadian perspective on Switzerland, a European perspective on Switzerland, etc., helps me understand Switzerland better, and therefore helps me, hopefully at least, promote Swiss interests better in a targeted way and in any given context. So from that perspective, it wasn't a strategy, but I think it was very beneficial to my work.
Mm-hmm. And as I said, you're already in the kind of final weeks of your posting in Canada. But before we kind of dive a little bit closer into your experiences here, you actually had been to Canada quite some time before, I think in your 20s, and undertaken some quite adventurous cross-Canada tour back in the day. Would you mind sharing some of your experiences from back then?
Yeah, that was a fantastic trip, I have to say. It 30 years ago, indeed, and a friend of mine and myself, we hitchhiked from BC, from Vancouver, all the way to Halifax. And what really struck to me, I mean, of course, the size of Canada and its diversity is just mind-boggling for somebody coming from Switzerland, which is, when it comes to the territory, at least a small country. It was my first time in a big city. It was like Toronto. It's the first time I saw a bear in the wild near Banff. I remember that. It was also the last time I saw a bear in the wild, and I don't mind that at all. It's my first time attending a really large music festival, the Montreal Jazz Festival. First time I saw a self-serve granola counter that in Sault Ste. Marie. I remember that very, very well, very vividly. First time I ate poutine. But the most impressive thing of this trip to me was the generosity of Canadians. I mean, we would be picked up when we were hitchhiking, we were picked up by somebody, and not once, but several times, people would actually like add another 100 kilometers of their way just to drop us to where we wanted to go. And they would offer us, accommodation. We could stay at people's places. They included us in their daily lives for 1 or 2 days. And that kind of generosity, openness, curiosity, that is frankly awesome. I couldn't find a better word. It was just awesome and impressive.
Mm-hmm. I guess you were very lucky in having had the chance to hitchhike in Canada and experience a very positive trip across the country. In between the 2 or 2.5 decades since your first trip, a lot has changed. And
yeah, a lot has changed.
You obviously have taken off on a grand career as ambassador, and you've been here, as I said, since February 2019. If you look at the past 3.5 years, people might be interested what your work has been like, what you remember most fondly, also maybe where you see the main differences and similarities between life in Switzerland and Canada.
Well, my tenure, like everybody else's life, my tenure has, of course, been marked by the pandemic. So I didn't get to travel as much as I would have liked to. And I think traveling, going out of Ottawa is very important. It would be an advice to any diplomat, newly posted diplomat in Canada, is like, go experience this country in real. So I didn't get to do that. No need to hitchhike, no. But so I didn't get to visit the country as much as I would have liked to, but I did experience something else. I did experience, and I've mentioned it already, an enormous generosity and solidarity of Canadians during this pandemic, and Canadians of all walks of life. And this is for me a really fantastic opportunity also to express my gratitude. I think Canada managed this COVID pandemic really well, both from the point of view of preventing deaths, as well as from the point of view of the economic impact. And this is not just, by the way, me saying that, or it's not just my feeling, but it is actually backed up by several studies. And one of the key elements, in my opinion, was that the policy didn't just focus on access, access to support, access to vaccines, etc., but it was focusing on equity of access. And I think that, again, was a very successful, quite unique approach that the Canadian authorities chose. So obviously, while the pandemic is no highlight, the experience of how Canadian society overall dealt with this pandemic, with this crisis, to me is a highlight, and I will always remember that. You mentioned, or you asked about similarities and differences between Canada and Switzerland. I mean, the similarities are quite well known. So we're both federal states, we're both multilingual states, similar socioeconomic challenges. We have convergent economic and innovative policy landscapes. We are both like-minded in the multilateral field. And we used to take this really for granted. It's like we're like-minded, but I think in today's world of disruption, it's worth reminding each other that we are truly like-minded countries, both stand up for rules-based international orders, peace and stability, protection of human rights, climate change, Agenda 2030. So there's a lot of similarities on that front. We are also both members of the Francophonie, of the OECD, of the OSCE. Switzerland is an observing country of the Arctic Council, where, of course, Canada is a very important member. Cybersecurity is one, climate change is one. The notion of a liberal market economy is one. We have very good trading relations. Canada is our second most important partner economically in the Americas. We have also strong human relations. I think that's something to add as well. There's about 41,000 Swiss nationals in Canada, double nationals or just Swiss nationals, but residing in Canada. And that's the second biggest Swiss cohort outside of Europe worldwide. So the Swiss immigrants really have Canada as one of their most favorite destinations. But there's also differences, and I think it would be a shame to just brush over those differences, because I think they're quite telling. And actually these differences, in my opinion, create quite a bit of opportunity. So obviously, you know, different locations, different geographies, different sizes, that leads to different geopolitics. And so Canada, for instance, of course, is a NATO member. Switzerland isn't. We're not a NATO member state. We're a neutral country. And sometimes this neutrality also here in Canada is seen as you know, doing nothing. And I would really beg to differ on that one, because I think Switzerland can use and is using the status of neutrality to offer platforms for negotiations, for mediation, as a go-between, the so-called good officers. And we can do so, and we do so credibly. And by this, we actually do create value, for a lack of better word, for the international community. And it's, but the other misconception I would like to add here is that, you know, neutrality does not by default preclude the adoption of sanctions. Switzerland has adopted sanctions in the past and has most recently done so with regard to the war in Ukraine against Russia. So that's a clear difference. But another one which is sort of tied to this one is that Canada, of course, is a middle power. It's a G7 member, it's a G20 member, and as such has probably more than Switzerland does, has a capacity to be a leader on certain global issues or international issues. There is also an element that is more domestically, but feeds into these differences, of course, which is the different political systems or different political traditions, I'd say. So in the Canadian case, it's the Westminster system. And in that system, I do notice there's an element of competition baked into that system, right? In the Swiss system of direct democracy, that one is much more focused, much more tailored towards consensus solutions. So this leads to different styles in political discourse in general, but also different instruments. And actually, this can lead to misunderstandings. We do have the same goals. We do have very much convergent interests globally. We are like-minded, but we have different styles, different leverage, for sure, as well, and different diplomatic instruments. And so rather than seeing this as a risk, I actually look at it as an opportunity, because if you combine these two different styles to the same goal, you have the opportunity to increase your impact through complementarity. You have a bigger footprint. And so this is something that I've really very much enjoyed working with Canada, to combine forces with different styles to increase impact, visibility, and outcome.
Mm-hmm. And you kind of indicate already this kind of areas of potential for collaboration, I guess, between Switzerland and Canada, given those kind of supportive aspects of differing political cultures. When you look back over the past 3.5 years, where would you say you saw the most progress in the bilateral relationships, or what were the focus areas from an embassy perspective in the past years where you could also add a benefit or add value to the relationship?
Yeah, when you ask about the focus areas, I have to say one of the most dominant focus areas, of course, were the consular was the consular work. So that's for the Swiss citizens in Canada during COVID, particularly with regards to travel restriction, passports, etc. So we had to put a lot of energy as an embassy into supporting the Swiss community in Canada. And that is an opportunity for me now to also thank our colleagues in Montreal and Vancouver. And of course, here in Ottawa, the team in Ottawa for their fantastic work. It wasn't easy. But apart from the consular support and services that we provided, to me, the Swiss-Canadian cooperation in science, technology, and innovation is, I would say, the single most important priority of my work here. The potential is just staggering. It's huge. We have both very competitive, globally competitive ecosystems, and throughout the entire sort of value chain, so from research to development to actually, application and manufacturing. Switzerland, and that's something that I like reminding Canadian friends and interlocutors quite regularly, Switzerland is the 5th most important foreign investor in Canada. And a lot of that investment goes into innovative industries. But having said this, I think it's also very important to improve or further enhance awareness of that potential. So we made really good progress in strategically important awareness raising actions. So I'd like to mention here in particular the first Swiss-Canadian Cleantech Innovation Summit, which brought together around 200 leaders, not just from the research, not just from the business side, not just on the political side, but together. And I think this interaction is very, very important in order to sense, where the opportunities are and to raise awareness on our mutual strengths. Or another one, which of course you yourself are the leading actor and conveyor, is the Swiss Canadian Innovation Day, and which have been ongoing for a number of years. This year it was on science diplomacy in the exponential age. So that was more of a prospective exchange on, how science diplomacy can enhance diplomacy, science, but also the economy, and what challenge that creates for our societies. And I think we need to be aware of these challenges and we need to address them across the board. And then other interesting events that we had, I just mention one other which falls into the same category, is the Innovation Fest that was organized by the consulate in Vancouver, which addressed the interface between science and art. And that's another thing that sometimes we forget when we look at the silos. We do economic policy, we do science policy, we do art and culture, but how do they interact, and how can we use the interface? How can we use the interface between two countries to promote a better understanding beyond our countries? I think, so these are some of the highlights where I do think we have a strategic interest, both Switzerland and Canada, and where we've made progress despite the pandemic. And a lot of that progress was held virtually, and I'm happy to have it in person again. But I do find we've made a lot of progress, and I hope that this goes on into the future. Actually, I don't hope, I know this will go on in the future.
Yeah, I guess for both countries, the fact that innovation is so key to their economies will be a continuing force to collaborate.
Absolutely.
Both internationally and bilaterally, specifically between Switzerland and Canada as well.
Yeah.
You briefly mentioned the Swiss colony in Canada. Did you ever have a chance to kind of reach out and meet Swiss people in Canada? What's your impression of Swiss people in Canada that may have been here for several years, if not decades?
The interesting thing about the Swiss cohort in Canada is that it's really diverse. So you have Swiss, established here for several generations already, who still show an interest in their Swiss roots. Many are in the agricultural sector originally, but by now you have from the researcher to the doctors. The most famous one, of course, probably my best known one being Dr. Peter Uni, who was the director of the Ontario COVID Science Table. So you have the scientists, you have the business people, you have the students. So I just appreciate the diversity of the Swiss community here. And I also very much appreciate how they are still interested in keeping a link to Switzerland, celebrating tradition, or also adapt Swiss tradition to find, something new here, to develop something new. There is one person who creates sort of a mixture between a fondue and a hot dog, by pouring where normally the sausage would be, he puts the cheese. And so it's just wonderful to see the Swiss footprint here in Canada, and how also they are fond of Canada, whether they're Canadians or whether they newly arrived Canadians. So it's also very easy in that sense group of people that is creating a bridge that I as a diplomat or we as an embassy could not build on our own. So they're really crucial for Swiss-Canadian relations.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And it would seem, I mean, despite all the sports rivalries, be it in hockey or skiing, Swiss and Canadians have a good mutual understanding and respect for the love of the mountains, obviously. Not just because of our podcast series, but in general terms, love of nature as well. And so it's not too hard, I would argue, for Swiss people to adapt to the Canadian environment.
No, and I think there has actually been a study once that compared affinities, and apparently that's according to that study, the Swiss and Canadian societies have a strong affinity for each other. And I think the love for the outdoors, but also the love for culture and diversity is something that is really quite similar in both Switzerland and Canada. Mm-hmm. Though I would like to add, against my best wishes, I think the Swiss will never really be as good in hockey as the Canadians are. I mean, that's fine.
Obviously, as an ambassador, you had very strenuous times, not least because of COVID, but you also have a private life. When you look at the time here in Canada, outside of the work realm, what kind of stood out for you?
Well, like everybody else, my spouse Maria and I, we spent a lot of time at home during lockdowns and COVID restrictions. And let me just say, as a diplomat, I am posted somewhere and I have a job and I have colleagues and I'm being supported. But it just made me realize once again, the diplomat spouses, they come along. And they don't have a job and they don't have sort of a preconceived network. So they have to build their own network. And I was just so impressed by my spouse, how she reached out. She's an artist, so how she engaged in the artist community here, how she built her own network. And at the same time, helped me when we had to go virtual, she helped me understanding all these sort of technological thingies. So by now, we slayed a banana cake. We're really good at baking. We've learned a bit about veggie growing, but what we both really are fond of and loved doing here in Ottawa and around Ottawa was mountain biking. And we've made some wonderful friends mountain biking. If I may sneak in a little commercial here.
For the best trail?
No, for the people of Ride Ottawa, which are mountain bike teachers or instructors. They're just fantastic instructors and by now wonderful friends of ours. And we were really, really grateful for how they showed us the surroundings of beautiful Ottawa, Gatineau Park, etc., and told us things about Canadian life, including tailgate parties with, socially distanced tailgate parties, but tailgate parties after all. So that was just a wonderful induction to Canada.
A colleague of yours from the Embassy of Switzerland in France, he also is an avid biker. It seems that there's a new form of sports diplomacy coming around in Switzerland. It's obviously very healthy, so it's positive.
It is, and it connects you with nature. It takes you to places, and of course, on a bike you're very mobile. You can anytime you can just say, well, let's go there, let's go there. It's a sustainable way of exploring a neighborhood or a region, and so I think he's the road biking type, and we are more the mountain biking type. So we should probably team up and indeed do some bike diplomacy.
Very good. As a last question, maybe hard for a diplomat, but I'll ask it nevertheless. If you could take one thing from Canada that you think or wish that Swiss people should have, and one thing that Swiss also that Switzerland has that would be worthwhile for Canada to adapt, what would that be from your perspective?
So one thing I would bring from Switzerland, I think, is public transport. Definitely probably more challenging in Canada because of size and temperatures. But I do find Switzerland has fantastic public transport, and I would have liked to have better, more frequent train access here. And maybe one thing that I would like to see Switzerland adopt from Canada is an openness to the other, an openness to newcomer, a curiosity towards the newcomer, which is something that really impressed me here. And again, I try to bring to my next posting and hopefully have learned from.
Mm-hmm. And this brings us to the end of our podcast of today. The series is called From the Alps to the Rockies. In your case, it will be soon the other way around, from the Rockies to the Alps. You indicated your next post. It's coming up soon, and it will be actually as ambassador of Switzerland to Austria. So for that transition to Europe, we wish you all the best and a very good start. Be it on your bike or just straight in the offices of the embassy in Vienna. All the best from here, and thank you for your participation.
Thank you very much, Rose.